So, my first question for you all as we start tonight, as we think about healing from broken relationships in our families, is how many of you think that all families are dysfunctional? Just raise your hand. So, we're just going to do vote. So, everybody who says, yeah, all families are dysfunctional, raise your hands up. Okay, look around. All right. Now, how many of you would say, no, not all families are dysfunctional? Okay, we got some of those too. I don't know if it's half and half or not. Typically, when I ask my students that question, I do have a mixture of answers. And the kind of reasons why kind of boil down to two things. People who say that all families are dysfunctional say, yeah, all families have problems, all families have difficulties, nobody's perfect. The no one's good, no, not one hypothesis, right, or idea. But this now applies to families. But the people who say, no, not all families are dysfunctional, it really has to do with the fact that, yes, we have problems, but if you don't handle them in a bad way, you're not dysfunctional. If you handle your conflict well, then you're doing okay. And those are kind of how the arguments come down. So, no matter where you fall on that, when we talk about dysfunction, it really kind of comes down to, in my opinion, how do you define dysfunction? What is that? Now, I'm going to give you a couple of families. I'm going to give you some examples. And I want you to, even on these, vote about whether or not these families are dysfunctional or not, okay? The first two families are famous families, people that you've probably heard about in the news. But you're going to have to guess who they are. All right, so this family, it's a couple. They have adopted children from all over the world. Anybody have any guesses already? I haven't even said what I was going to say. Brad and Angelina, right? Okay. So are they a dysfunctional family? Anyone? Okay, we got some votes on there, and they got divorced this year, right? Okay, how about this family? It's a family that's pretty large, lots of siblings in it. One of the females is married to a famous rapper. Okay, you got the Kardashians, right? Okay. Are they dysfunctional or not? Dysfunctional? Okay, I think that was the one that got the most votes. Okay, now I'm going to give you some examples from some other families. These ones are not famous, but you might know of these families, but I'll have you guess kind of towards the end. So this family is a family where the mom and the dad, they have several kids, but one is their favorite. And they treat this one kid better than all the rest, from the gifts that they give him to the chores that he has to do. And all his siblings hate him because of it. So much so that they probably even want to kill him. Dysfunctional or not dysfunctional? Okay. Anyone guess who I'm talking about? Joseph. Yeah, all right. Okay. This one you might get from right off the bat. Mom and dad got together in an affair. Mom was already married. They got together, they married eventually. The baby that they conceived during their affair eventually died. Dad had many other kids also from other women. One of the brothers raped his sister. Anybody say dysfunctional? Okay, and guess, I already heard a guess down here. David and Bathsheba. All right. One final family. This one you won't know the answer to, so don't even try to guess. But for this particular family, parents divorced, had 3 kids, divorced when the kids were really, really young. And there was 2 sons and a daughter. One of the sons ended up as a teenager getting involved in a couple DUIs, driving under the influence, ended up in jail a couple times. Other sibling got arrested for attempted murder at one point, and so on and so forth. Sound dysfunctional? Okay, yeah. That's my family. Lots of dysfunction, right, in all the families that I've described. But it comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But obviously, that's not what God intended from the very beginning, right? God intended the family to be a place of support and love and nurturance and care and mutual respect. But unfortunately, and we all know that Satan has it in for the family. It's a place where he has chosen to enter in and try and kill, steal, and destroy, right? Because that's where we grow and change and develop our understanding of who God is and how we relate to him and how we relate to the world. So now what do we do? If we see that there's dysfunction in all sorts and shapes and sizes, how do we find healing from that. I'm going to suggest that first we have to be honest about what the dysfunction is in our families, like name it, say what it is, recognize it. Then we have to be willing to figure out how to mourn and grieve our losses. And then we have to change and choose to change and be different from our families in those areas of dysfunction. So the first thing is thinking about how do we recognize dysfunction? How do we define it? How do you become honest about the dysfunction in your families? So, like I said, it looks different in different families, but I'll give you some examples of because a lot of times it's not just that there was alcoholism or attempted murder or affairs and so on. It's not just those type of things. A lot of times dysfunction comes in the form of just patterns of how we relate to each other. So I'll give you some examples. I want you to take your hands and go like this. Just touch your fingers together. All right. If we're going to use this, your hands together, as an example of a family and how family is supposed to relate to each other, these are the members. And what is healthy family interaction is for people to be touching, so they're connected somehow. And I'm talking now about emotional connection. So they're connected, they're dependent on each other, but they're also independent. They're not like clasped like this. They do connect, and they keep that connection. They maintain it in a healthy way by being independent and dependent, mutually interdependent, really. Now, if we think about some unhealthy patterns, go like this. Now, picture the family members like this, and you try and pull your hands apart, and you can't. That type of interaction in a family is actually not a healthy interaction, because what you have is you have family members who can't behave on their own. You can't separate people from each other. So they can't think the way they want to think. They can't feel the way they want to feel. And when they try to think or feel or do differently than the rest of the family, there's consequences. And consequences aren't necessarily like, go to your room, you're in timeout. Consequences are, well, now I'm not talking to you. Now I'm angry with you. And think about how that might look. You go off to college. Maybe your family's a family that's kind of like this. And your mom or your dad has to call every single day. What are your assignments? How are you doing? What are your grades? And you might be like, okay, I don't want to talk. I'm a senior now, Mom. Let me be. I'm figuring out my own life. Or it could even get more than that, where they're calling and saying, something terrible happened. And for you, maybe you're not involved. It wasn't terrible for you, but because you're not as upset as they are, now you're ostracized. You're not talked to. You're hurt. That's when we have over-connection. Now, another way, though, is you take these fingers and you separate them, and they go like this, right? Where people aren't connected at all. They aren't emotionally connected to each other. Maybe, of course, you live in the same household in that family, but people kind of come and go on their own. There's no sense that people, they love you, but that's really all, And so there's a lot of disconnection. So maybe going off to college really didn't change anything. You didn't talk much then. You don't talk much now. You don't know what's going on with people in your family. And that's disconnection. Which, again, is another unhealthy pattern. Imagine a triangle also like this, where you have 3 people in the triangle. So one's at the top and one are in each corner. Another unhealthy pattern is when you are placed in that triangle between 2 other people. You're placed in the middle. And you don't know which side to take. So it might be your mom's calling you on Monday saying, your dad did such and such. And dad's calling you on Tuesday saying, well, your mother, blah, 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 blah. And you don't know what to do because you love them both. But you don't want to take sides. So you're put in the middle of their conflict. Another unhealthy pattern. Imagine being a person in your family that you get the blame for everything. Well, mom and dad got divorced because, if the kids had just behaved better, then they never would have gotten divorced. If Johnny hadn't been using drugs in high school, mom and dad probably would have got along a lot better. That's the person who's now the blame for every problem in the family. Or maybe it's just you're the family hero, or now you can do no wrong, but everybody else in the family, watch out. Even that's a dysfunctional pattern. Maybe there's dysfunctional communication. So imagine getting like double messages. You want to come home for spring break and say, Mom, I'm coming home for spring break. I want to spend some time with you. And they're like, well, oh yeah, I'd love to spend some time with you. And then you get a phone call from one of your friends, and your friends say, hey, we want to spend some time at spring break. Okay, well, Mom, sorry. Is it okay if we kind of maybe spend some time when I come home after the semester is over because my friends want to hang out? And parent says, I can't believe you would do that. I want to spend time with you so much, and you're going to put your friends before me? No way. I can't believe you'd hurt your mother like that. So you go, okay, I'll put my friends aside. You go home. You go, okay, Mom, I'm all ready to spend time with you. And Mom says, don't you know I have to work? What do you think? I have all the time in the world to hang out with you? You get this double message. And with both ways, you get a major guilt trip, right? All of these are patterns that are all considered dysfunction. So we're thinking, that attempted murder and alcoholism and affairs, dysfunction. But also there's lots of patterns that can be dysfunctional. And unfortunately, if we don't do something to change those patterns in our own lives, we can recreate that in our new relationships. We can put our friends in the middle of a triangle, right in the middle of it where we don't mean to. We can give double messages to our roommates, and they're going crazy, going, well, what do you want? If we don't recognize and really become aware of the patterns that we become involved in, we can relive them, unfortunately. Now, families tend to pass these things down. Not purposefully. They don't look at their dysfunction and say, okay, I want to make sure you do all these same things, but it just happens. Now, I don't believe in generational curses. Ezekiel says the child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. And we all deal with and are accountable for our own sin. But we definitely do see patterns in families that can be changed. So the first thing is be honest about the dysfunction in your family. Do you have any of these patterns? Do you recognize and do you see them in your own families? Second is going to be to mourn your losses, to grieve those things that you did not have. I'm going to use the Israelites as an example tonight. Now, I'm assuming you know the history of the Israelites and coming out of Egypt, how God saved them from the Pharaoh, how they came to Mount Sinai, how they very soon came to the border of the Promised Land. They didn't know what to do, so they sent in spies to check out the land. The spies came back, and the majority of them gave a bad report. And this is what they said in Numbers 14:3. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? They said to each other. We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. And it's because, and what they said and realized in Numbers 13, they said we seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes when they saw the people of the land. So they were afraid, right? They looked at where they were going, and they said, no way, we can't do that. We'll go back to Egypt. And this is Egypt, right? This is a place that they'd been in exile for 400 years in slavery, and they wanted to go back. And I'm using them as an example for one thing, as I think one of the issues that they had is they had not dealt with their past. Egypt was the past. They hadn't dealt with that in any way, shape, or form. And it's interesting, Moses had told them and reminding them in Deuteronomy of kind of what they'd gone through. Deuteronomy 1:29 through 31, and this is my focus verse for tonight. It says, "Then I said to you," this was Moses told the people, "do not be terrified. Don't be afraid of them. The Lord your God who's going before you will fight for you, as he did for you in Egypt, before your very eyes and in the wilderness. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his son, all the way you went until you reached this place." Reminding them of where they were in Egypt, what God had done, and what he was going to do for them. But they said, let's go back. They hadn't dealt with the past. And I think what we can learn from them is we have to come to terms with our past. We have to grieve our losses. And then we have to develop the correct perspective about the past also. So let's think about grieving our losses and coming to terms with our past. We have to accept whatever that dysfunction was. We have to see the ways in which it's affected us. Do any of you guys have any scars, physical scars? Okay, I do. We all have them, right? And some of the ones I have are from when I was 6 years old. Right? I burned my arm on something on a grill, and I still have the burn from when I was 6. I rode a bike and got my feet caught in the pedals. I still have that scar. Now, I want you to think about scars. Scars, in and of themselves, if we look at them, the scar that I have on my wrist, it's not an oozing wound, right? It's healed, and that's what a scar represents. And a lot of times our family dysfunction creates scars, right? But they're emotional scars, emotional wounds. But unfortunately, sometimes we don't just have scars from our emotional issues in our family. Sometimes the things that we've dealt with, they're oozing, gross, nasty, disgusting wounds, even now, from things that maybe happened years and years and years ago. So the question is, do you have any of those? Are the things that come from your family dysfunction, are they scars, which you look at and you go, okay, I was hurt, but I've been healed? Or are they oozing wounds? And you can know that by looking at the emotional effects. What does your life look like? What do your relationships look like? Are they problematic? Do you come and go from relationships? Do you have a lot of conflict in your relationships? Or do you just suffer from anxiety or fear or insecurity? Do you have struggles with bitterness, resentment, unforgiveness? Whether that's toward current people in your life or toward people in your past. Those are evidence that maybe your wounds haven't healed. So we have to, though, be willing to look at those, to say, okay, what are they? Have they healed? And where do I stand right now? And if they are still oozing, to do something about it, right? Now, obviously, when we do something about it, it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy to recognize our wounds, to look at ourselves and go, oh, I'm still hurting from the dysfunction in my family. That's not an easy thing. But one thing that I've found very true is that what has been hurt in relationships can be healed in relationships. So that means you need people in your life who can be there to love you unconditionally, accept you for who you are as you grow and change. So that means also keeping you accountable to those areas of growth and change, being willing to call you out when they say, hey, remember that thing that you said you're still working on? But to let them be there for you. But also to be willing to feel the pain. Remember, it's about mourning your losses, feeling and grieving what you didn't have, looking at your families and say, okay, there's things that I really wish had been there, and actually were God's plan for my family, but I did not get. It's being willing to feel the hurt of that, because it's there. You know, all the families that we discussed at the beginning, there was pain. That's the one kind of common thing. Even though we're all different families, one thing I know for sure in all those families, there was pain. And we have to be willing to let ourselves feel the pain. So what does that mean? It means not suppressing the pain, not avoiding it, not ignoring it, but letting ourselves feel it. But know this, those feelings won't last forever. Sometimes people think that if I let myself feel the sadness and the loss over what I didn't get, what I didn't have, what all that dysfunction was, if I let myself feel it, it will never end. It will. It may not end right away. It may not end tomorrow, but feelings do change. Feelings are temporary just by the nature of them. And it's okay to feel them. Because when we don't let ourselves feel them, actually it makes it worse. We think it makes it better, but it actually makes it a lot worse. So we let ourselves feel them. And what that means is kind of being very aware of your feelings. And right now, you probably have not thought about the chair you're sitting in at all since you got here, right? But now, think about that chair, just for a second. Notice it, see how it feels on your body, how comfortable you are, right? Jump around in it a little bit, whatever makes you. The minute you start noticing something, because if we don't pay attention to something, it kind of just become background to us. And what I'm saying is to notice your feelings, to pay attention to that pain, and to simply allow yourself to grieve. And we grieve over many things. Most of the time, the things we grieve over are deaths, losses, right? Losses of like a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship where someone you know passed away. But I'm talking about grieving what you didn't get in your family and letting yourself notice those feelings and be okay with them. So we're honest about our dysfunction and we grieve our losses. And then we choose to do something different. Remember, like I said, unless we make a change, unless we choose differently, those patterns can continue in our lives. So we choose differently. Now, this is hard, one, because I'm sure you hear it over and over again. But one of the first things I would say is choose forgiveness. Like I said, people say that over and over again. Obviously, we're commanded to forgive in the Bible, right? So we should do it. But a lot of the time we don't hear, how do you do it? How do you forgive? And one well-known psychologist who's a Christian has really studied forgiveness. His name is Everett Worthington. And he says that forgiveness is, you can really break it down into two pieces. There's a decisional part of forgiveness and an emotional part of forgiveness. The decision part is the easy part, where we say, well, God says to forgive, I need to forgive, I'm going to forgive that person. I've made a decision to forgive. That's the first part. Where we say, I'm purposely choosing, for example, not to get revenge, right? That's a choice that we make. I'm not going to do anything to hurt this person. I'm not going to do anything to avoid this person anymore. I'm not going to get revenge, so I've chosen to forgive. That part comes pretty quickly for most people. The second part is the emotional part. That's the part that is the work in progress for a lot of us. Because the emotional part means taking those feelings of anger and bitterness and hostility and hurt and pain, taking those feelings and actually changing them into feelings of acceptance, respect for the other person again, maybe even love for that person, or at least positive feelings. So going from all these negative things to something actually positive. That's an emotional change that takes time. So how do we do that? Because we're asking you to do something with your feelings, right? Well, one of the things that Worthington suggests is finding a way to empathize with the person who hurt you. So if it's a family member, that means looking at what they've done, being honest about it to yourself, grieving that loss, and then saying, okay, how do I empathize with that person now? Empathy comes from being able to recognize that I am similar to that person. To be able to look at them and go, you know what? I could have done those things too. I could hurt people in that way too. We're all people. We're all sinners. And somehow being able to connect with them on such a level where you're able to say, wow, that could have been me. If we can get to that point, that's empathy. And the more we can empathize with someone, the easier it is to have positive feelings towards that person, which means then the emotional part of forgiveness has begun. Now, we forgive for a couple of reasons. Well, one, because it's commanded, but also we forgive because, well, it's good for us, right? We know that if we hold grudges, it actually hurts us more than it hurts the other person. That's something we all know, right? But when we forgive, it actually helps our emotional and our mental health, because unforgiveness is linked to anxiety and depression and acting out type behaviors when we're unforgiving. So if we can forgive because God tells us, we forgive because it helps ourselves, but even better than that is forgive because we want to offer grace to the person who's hurt us. And what's grace? It's undeserved favor, right? That's another even better way and reason to forgive. And what's been found is when people forgive because they want to give a gift to somebody else, the forgiveness lasts longer than doing it just because it's good for me and just because God tells me to. When they just want to give a gift of grace to someone else, the forgiveness lasts. So we forgive. We work towards it. Second, we develop a new perspective about the past. Now, remember I talked about the Israelites. Now, I'd read what they said, we want to go back to Egypt, right? Well, remember there were two spies who also went to the land who had a different report, Joshua and Caleb. What did they say? They said, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. God's with us. He'll go before us. He'll protect us. Whereas everybody else said, no, let's go back to Egypt. Somehow Joshua and Caleb had a different perspective on the situation. But I think they had a different perspective on that situation because they knew and understood and had a perspective on their past that was very, very different. So as you think about your own past, think about how you view it. How do you understand where God was in it, what his place was in your past? Now remember the verse I said was my verse for tonight was Deuteronomy, right? I said to you, don't be terrified. Don't be afraid of them. The Lord your God is going before you and he'll fight for you as he did for you in Egypt. So I want you to kind of place yourself in that, right? You're not the Israelites, but I want you to think about how has God been with you in your past, with your family, in the midst of your family dysfunction. Well, he's going before you now. He will fight for you as he did for you in the past, before your very eyes, even in the wilderness, right? The wilderness was this terrible, bleak place, right? But God was with them even in the wilderness. And they said that God carried you as a father carries his son. If we use that perspective on our pasts, when it comes to our families and the dysfunction in our families, it changes our perspective. That God was carrying you like a father carries a son. He was with you, and he'll continue to fight for you. I think that's what Joshua and Caleb understood. They understood when they looked back at the past, and when they turned around, they looked and they said, they saw something different than the other Israelites saw. They said, God was with us then. He'll be with us now. Why wouldn't he? Look what he has done. When we don't have the correct perspective, it limits everything we understand about our current situation, about God. Take your hand, again, this time close one eye and just put, like you're looking through a telescope, and look around. If you notice, in order to see the person next to you, you have to turn your head, right? All the way. If you just look straight ahead, you can't see them very well, right? All right, so you have go ahead and put your hand down. You have a very limited perspective like that, right? But now when you take your hand off, don't you see so much better? When you unlimit your perspective, things change. You get to see everything. And that's what Joshua and Caleb did. They had an everything perspective as opposed to that limited perspective. They knew where God was in it. So part of dealing with our past is simply having a different perspective. And then we deal with our present. We accept where God has us. I want to read for you Deuteronomy 2, 1 through 7. This is now they're about to go into the promised land. They have to pass through another territory. And this is but God says, you can't have that territory. You're going on to the next one. So he says to them, don't provoke these people. I'll not give you any of their land, not even a little as a footstep, because I've given that to someone else. You can buy food from them, you can buy water from them, but you can't have what they have. It says, God has blessed you in all that you've done. He's known your wanderings through this great wilderness. He's been with you, and you haven't lacked a thing, he tells them. Look at your foot. It's not very big, right? And he tells them, when you go through this land, you don't even get a footstep of that land. You're even going to have to buy food from them. You can look at and they just came out of the wilderness, right? A great and terrible wilderness. And now you see this land flowing with milk and honey? No, you're going to a different area. Someone else has got this one. Now remember, you haven't lacked anything this whole way, so keep that in mind. Now, this is what I think we need to learn from this passage. When we look at our present situation, we also have to have a different perspective. Because for those Israelites, their perspective was, we want something different. I'm going to look around, I see everybody else has something different. What do you look around when you see when you look at other people's families? Have you ever said, gosh, I wish I had a family like that? And God's answer to us is similar to the answer to the Israelites. He says, sorry, maybe because of someone's sin, that's not for you. Unfortunately, you didn't get that. But he says, but remember, I've been with you this whole time and you haven't lacked anything. I think it's often I kind of get shocked when I hear God say that, because he said, you just came through a wilderness, a great and terrible one, and while you were there, you didn't lack anything. I said, well, wait a second. They had the same food every single day. They didn't have the promised land. They were wandering for 40 years. How can you not lack anything? And then I think, gosh, my family, we had all these crazy things going on. How could you say I didn't lack anything? And I think what God's saying is, he's not saying that you didn't have things you didn't want. Of course you did. We all have things we want that maybe are different. I think he's saying, but what you had and what you have is you have me. Am I enough? So the bottom line, when it comes to healing from broken family relationships, we do those three things. We are honest about our dysfunction in our family. We see it, we name it, we recognize what it is. And it doesn't have to be alcoholism or attempted murder or affairs, right? It could be many things. But then we grieve what we lost. We let ourselves feel that pain. Then we choose something different. We choose forgiveness. We choose a different perspective on the past. And we look at where we are right now and we say, God, you are enough.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.